Hey guys, my name is Trey Wilson. I'm a sophomore at Lafayette, and I'm here on behalf of Leestown Kappa Club. The book I have today is Charles Drew, doctor who got the world pumped to donate blood. This story was written and illustrated by Mike Venezza. Charles Richard Drew was born on June 3rd, 1904, in Washington, D.C. Charles Drew succeeded at everything he did. He was a great scientist, doctor, surgeon, teacher, and athlete. Dr. Drew's discoveries in the field of blood transfusions helped save the lives of thousands of people. Here's an image of Dr. Drew. Dr. Charles Drew found ways for people to safely donate and receive blood. He also helped develop a system called a blood bank to store large amounts of blood for long periods of time. Blood banks made it possible for more people to get blood quickly if they needed it during surgery or after a serious injury. Although Charles Drew developed more successful ways to store and use blood, he didn't invent blood transfusions. Hundreds of years ago, doctors started trying to give people blood to replace blood loss after injuries. As long ago as 1667, a French doctor tried transferring lamb's blood into a patient, but it didn't work. Doctors didn't really understand what blood was made of or how to transfer it from person to person until the early 1900s, when Charles Drew was still a kid. There's an image of a man who got a blood transfusion with a lamb. As a kid, Charles was known as Charlie. Charlie grew up in a loving family. The Drews lived in an area of Washington, D.C., near the Potomac River. Because it was so foggy there, Charlie's neighborhood was called Foggy Bottom. Charlie's family had just barely enough money to keep from being poor. Charlie's father was a carpet installer. His mother had a teaching degree, but decided to stay at home full-time to raise her family. The Drews were African American. Charlie grew up during a time when there was a lot of racial prejudice in the United States. Much of the country, including Washington, D.C., was segregated. Black citizens were separated from white citizens. African Americans had to use separate restaurants, movie theaters, schools, bathrooms, and swimming pools. They also were kept out of many jobs and were denied many basic rights, such as voting. Here is an image of Washington, D.C., and here's an image of a segregated water fountain. Mr. and Miss Drew taught their children not to let the prejudice of others stand in their way. They taught them to get a good education, work hard, and achieve whatever goals they set for themselves. All the Drew children were expected to bring home top grades, attend church every Sunday, and help around the house with daily chores. To save money, they were taught how to sew and patch their own clothes. Sewing was a skill that came in handy for Charlie later on when he became a surgeon. There's a funny cartoon of a guy who had surgery and he sewed the stitches. It says, "Your operation was a great success, Mr. Glump. Sorry about the stitches. It's a habit left over from my youth. Besides, it's Valentine's Day." Washington, D.C. had segregated schools when Charlie was growing up, but some of its schools for African American students were among the best schools in the United States. Charlie went to one of those schools, Dunbar High School. Dunbar hired excellent teachers and set very high standards for its students. First row, third from left. Here's Charlie right here. Here's Charles Drew right there at his school. While Charlie was at Dunbar, it became clear that he wasn't just a great student, but also a great athlete. He became a star in Dunbar's swimming, football, basketball, track, and baseball teams. Between studying and practicing sports, it's amazing that Charlie could keep all of his activities straight. Charles Drew did so well in sports that he won an athletic scholarship to attend Amherst College in Massachusetts. It says, "Psst. Hey Charlie, I think today is swimming practice." Before Charlie left for Amherst, his family suffered a terrible tragedy. Charlie's 12-year-old sister, Elise, died of tuberculosis, a lung disease. Losing his sister made Charlie start to think about becoming a doctor. A big change was in store for Charlie when he arrived at Amherst College. It was the first school he attended where almost all the students were white. Sometimes he was treated unfairly or snubbed because of his race. But he didn't let that stop him. Charles always remembered the lessons his parents taught him. He decided not to waste his time getting angry, but to prove people wrong by being the best student and athlete he could be. It's an image of Charles and his family. While at Amherst, Charles Drew helped his school win important championship football games. During one game, Charlie was seriously injured when an opposing player stomped on his leg. The spikes went deep into his leg. Charlie was rushed to the hospital. While he was being treated, a friendly doctor asked Charlie if he'd like to come along to see how doctors worked in a hospital. Charlie took him up on his offer. It was an important moment in helping Charlie decide his future. He was fascinated to see how doctors treated patients in emergency situations. After this experience, Charles Drew was sure he wanted to become a doctor. Here's an image of Charles again in his football uniform and a cartoon of him touring the hospital. In 1926, Charles Drew graduated from Amherst College. Not only had he brought fame to Amherst on the playing field, but he graduated with top grades. Charles Drew had everything going for him, except for one thing: money. Charles didn't have nearly enough money to pay for medical school, so right away, he took a job as a teacher and coach at Morgan College in Baltimore, Maryland. Finally, after working for 2 years, he had saved up enough for medical school. Charles applied to and was accepted at McGill University's medical school in Montreal, Canada. Even though Charles took his studies seriously, he still found time for sports. He even set records for McGill's track team. After 5 years, Charles graduated at the top of his class. In 1933, Charles Drew achieved his dream. He had become a doctor of medicine. Here's him in his basketball picture, and here's a picture of McGill University. While in medical school, Charles had become interested in the science of blood. He learned that it was very difficult to donate and store blood safely. Everyone in the world has one of 4 major blood types: type A, type B, type AB, or O. A person needing blood has to be matched up with the correct blood type, or they could die. During Dr. Drew's time, the big problem was how to store all the different blood types long enough to where there could be enough blood available for whoever needed it. Blood could be kept for only about 7 days before it spoiled. Sometimes when a hospital ran out of the correct blood, they would have to try and find a donor to match the patient's blood type. By the time they found someone, it might be too late. Dr. Drew wanted to find a solution to this problem. After medical school, he spent several years improving his skills as a doctor, surgeon, and teacher. Then he turned his attention to solving the problem of blood storage. In 1938, Charles Drew was awarded a fellowship to do research on blood at Columbia University's medical school in New York City. While at Columbia, he made an important discovery about blood plasma. Plasma is the clear liquid in which blood cells float. Dr. Drew discovered that it was red blood cells, the cells that carry oxygen throughout the body, that were causing the problem in storing blood. Red blood cells spoil after just a few days. Dr. Drew found that if you could remove red blood cells, the remaining plasma could be preserved for weeks. Another good thing about plasma is that it doesn't contain any red cells, so there's no need to worry about matching it to one of the 4 different blood types. Anybody could use any plasma. In an emergency situation, plasma could keep people alive until their bodies can make more blood of their own. While directing a blood bank at Columbia, Dr. Drew developed ways to freeze or dry plasma so that it could be shipped to wherever it was needed. Here are human blood cells, and this is him at a blood bank. During this busy time, Dr. Drew managed to fall in love and get married. Charles met his future bride, Lenore Robbins, during a trip to a medical conference. Charles and Lenore were married in 1939. They eventually had 4 children. Charles Drew had always had a good sense of humor, nicknamed their first daughter BB after blood bank. In 1940, Dr. Drew finished his studies at Columbia University. He then continued his research on blood at Howard University in Washington, D.C. As it turned out, Dr. Drew's important discoveries about blood storage came just in the nick of time. World War II, which would become one of the most destructive, deadly wars in history, was just starting in Europe. Here's Dr. Drew and his family, and here's a cartoon. The German dictator Adolf Hitler and his armies were determined to take over Europe. London, England was being bombed constantly by Germany. Injured soldiers and citizens were there. Injured soldiers and citizens there needed blood desperately. Dr. Drew was asked to return to New York to help run a program called Blood for Britain. The British needed thousands of units of blood right away. Only a man like Dr. Charles Drew could have handled such a huge task. Dr. Drew began by setting up blood banks to collect donations all over New York City. He then ordered trucks to be equipped with storage refrigerators and nurses to collect blood in areas outside the city. The plasma was removed, frozen or dried, and shipped overseas. The Blood for Britain program was a huge success. Dr. Drew's discovery helped save the lives of thousands of people in England. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. Now America needed its own emergency blood supply. Once again, Dr. Drew was called upon, this time to head up the Red Cross National Blood Collection Program. Unfortunately, while Dr. Drew was setting up the program, he suffered one of the greatest disappointments of his life. He learned that the U.S. military had decided not to accept blood donations from African Americans. Because of the Army's prejudice, even Dr. Drew was able to donate blood. Drew and other scientists knew that there was absolutely no difference between blood from white people and blood from African American people. Dr. Drew was hurt, angry, and insulted. He had spent his life trying to overcome the fear of ignorance, and that caused prejudice. Being treated. Charles Drew protested this decision to exclude African American blood. The military eventually agreed to accept the blood of African Americans, but insisted that it be segregated from that of whites. Dr. Drew was deeply disappointed. As soon as the National Blood Program was up and running smoothly, he resigned his post and returned to Howard University in Washington, D.C. There, he began working on what he believed to be his greatest accomplishment. Howard University is a historically black college. It was started right after the Civil War in 1866 to educate former slaves. In the 1940s, Howard University's medical school didn't have a very strong reputation. Dr. Drew helped change that. He dedicated the rest of his life to teaching and training African American medical students. Dr. Drew was a fantastic teacher who inspired many students. Charles Drew didn't want to turn out doctors who were just good. He wanted to turn out doctors and surgeons who were the best in the country. Dr. Charles Drew achieved his goal. Many of his graduates went on to become the very best surgeons in the United States. Sadly, on April 1st, 1950, Charles Drew died in a car accident while on his way to a medical conference. He was only 45 years old. Dr. Charles Drew was an outstanding doctor, scientist, and teacher. Although his life was cut short, his accomplishments saved many lives and have inspired thousands of people in the world of medicine. And that is the story of Dr. Charles Drew. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.